Thanks, Stuart, and good morning to all of you. Thank you for coming out. So I'm going to be talking today about pragmatic clinical trials and a little bit also about our Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network here at OSU. And our Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network is about a year old, and it started out of a desire and a burden to help clinician researchers and non-clinician researchers translate their research into the clinical space and then also into the population health space. So I have a few objectives today. So first of all, I would like to make sure that we all have an understanding about what pragmatic clinical trials are and why we need them. I'm going to talk then about the services that you can get through the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network, as well as the partnerships you can get through our network. And then finally, just also want to go over what the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network can do for you. So first of all, I don't want to give away the answers. So first of all, how many of you are familiar with the term pragmatic clinical trial? It's okay. Great. Well, does anybody want to throw out a definition for what a pragmatic clinical trial is? All right, so basically a pragmatic clinical trial is a trial that is designed to test the effectiveness of an intervention in a broad, routine clinical practice. So you don't necessarily have control over the laboratory. It's a routine clinical practice. Pragmatic clinical trials are also designed with a lot of stakeholder input. So these are by nature very team-based studies. So you as the investigator bring your research question, and it is really, the research question isn't massaged, but the protocol in the study itself is really team-based. How are we going to implement it? How can it actually be delivered in a real-world clinical setting? And the reason we do this type of study is to make sure that we are producing evidence that can actually be used to improve care and applied generally. And this is very important because we learned from Amy that lack of reproducibility can be from bad science. So that can be from bad statistics, but it can also be from creating conclusions from environments that don't mimic your clinical environment and cannot actually be translated into your clinical environment. So a lot of times clinicians are left applying data that was developed from a square-shaped clinical environment to a round-shaped clinical environment. And we want to make sure that we are also helping researchers access a real-world clinical setting in designing clinical studies. And then we also want to be fast. So we want to accelerate research that informs policy and practice, and we want to remove the barriers to doing that for you. So pragmatic clinical trials are collaborative. They are designed also to improve practice and policy. So we want to ask questions that clinicians can actually apply to taking care of patients and that would be relevant in the current environment. We want to have diverse patients, and we want to use real-world practices as research sites, not only to help you get data quickly, but also to make sure that we're aware as a research team of what barriers there are to implementation and how things need to be delivered, because I think those things are just as important as the outcome and the intervention. Our study design for pragmatic clinical trials tend to be agile because you're not going to have these horribly complicated protocols in a real-world setting and asking clinicians to partner with you because you'll never end up recruiting a patient. And then you have to have pragmatic partnerships to do this. So this is not a type of study that is done in isolation. It really needs a team-based approach from clinicians, administrators, clinical staff, and there are also partnerships that require you to go out of your comfort zone. So especially if you're doing a pragmatic clinical trial in a clinical environment that is not your home clinical environment, you actually have to go out and build bridges and develop relationships and get buy-in for your research study in order to get it done. So I just want to talk briefly about PCTs versus RCTs. So if you're looking at a randomized controlled trial, which is the gold standard of research studies, you're doing them in a controlled research setting. These patient populations tend to be a little bit more homogeneous, often look at a singular outcome. They have longer study periods, and by nature, these are scientifically pure, complex studies, making sure you're comparing apples to apples as far as patients. If you look at a pragmatic clinical trial, you're looking at a more diverse population. It's in a routine clinical practice. You may look at multiple relevant outcomes, so not because you're trying to do so many studies that you'll get statistical significance, but you really want to look at outcomes that not only matter to the investigator, but also the clinicians who are partnering. These tend to be shorter studies, and you really want to look at the effectiveness of the intervention in a real-world setting. And there is a continuum of a randomized controlled trial versus a pragmatic clinical trial. There's a lot of overlap, but there are certainly hallmarks of a pragmatic clinical trial that are different than a randomized controlled trial that is not done in a real-world clinical setting. So the NIH has talked a lot about pragmatic clinical studies in the last few years, and it is also, I think, emphasizing their desire to make sure that the data that is being produced from research is actually applicable to patient populations. So I went through some of these things, but really you want to have representative participants, and you also want to make sure that you are doing your study in a way where data can be collected or an intervention can be developed or disseminated or applied in a clinical setting in a useful way that produces results that are relevant to patients and clinicians in their clinical decision making. So the other piece of a pragmatic clinical trial is that you have to have stakeholder input. So stakeholder input from the partners who are going to be helping you with your study. So often if you're approaching a clinical practice and saying, I would really like to do this intervention and investigation in your environment, they have to buy into your study enough to care and dedicate time and resources and inconvenience themselves in a way to help you succeed as a researcher. And sometimes this is easier to do if you're the investigator and it is your practice and you know the staff, and they will do that just because they care about you and trust you. But we don't all have the luxury of doing that as researchers, and very often we have to go out of our comfort zone into clinical environments to get stakeholders to buy into our studies. So when you're designing a pragmatic clinical trial, you also want to make sure that the questions you develop are important to the stakeholders, not just the clinicians, but the patients. It also needs to be a study that can actually be done in the clinical setting you're approaching. And it has to be something that is flexible enough that it won't alienate everybody who's helping you with your study, because otherwise no one's going to want to be on board. And finally, it needs to be something that's actually going to improve patient care. And I think those are big things that need to be considered in designing a pragmatic clinical trial. So things that are hallmarks of pragmatic clinical trials are assets and resources that we have, so our electronic health records, and then your randomization of treatment alternatives based on normal healthcare operations. And I think that these are tools that we have available at the medical center. We had a great talk about all the electronic tools we have available, but a lot of times it's hard to know, if you're entering a clinical environment, how are these tools really used in this particular environment? So how is the EHR used in this care setting to deliver population health interventions? And what are normal healthcare operations in this clinical setting that I'm trying to do a study in? And those are things that are very convoluted at times and are not necessarily intuitive for an investigator who is approaching a clinical network for studies. So why are this these trials needed. So we talked about the benefits and we talked about the barriers, but pragmatic clinical trials are needed to not only speed the pace of clinical research, but also to increase the efficiency and the cost effectiveness of clinical research. So pragmatic clinical trials, because they are faster, because they are simpler, because they're done in a real world setting, can often be done in a much more economic way than in a traditional RCT. We also want to look at interventions in diverse populations to make sure that when you are talking about an intervention or an outcome, that you are applying it to a broad patient population, so that if a clinician says, is this applicable to my geriatric patient who is from a minority background, that you can say, well, this was perhaps tested in a more homogeneous population in the RCT phase, but then we also tested this intervention in a broad population that did include this type of a patient. And then we also want to make research more applicable to real-world clinical settings. So I think the other piece of it that is more, I think, practical to researchers is that there is nationally a recognition about the need for pragmatic clinical trials, and there are specific RFAs that are coming out that are talking about pragmatic clinical studies being funded. And it's hard to do that and design these studies and apply for these funding opportunities if you don't innately have access to a pragmatic clinical setting, or you don't have access to somebody who can get you into that environment. So it's out of this need and this environment that we developed the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network. So the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network is an integrated hub for conducting real-world clinical studies. And it works to connect our investigators with our practice stakeholders and also with the necessary regulatory staff so that we can collaboratively develop and implement feasible and relevant clinical research in the real-world setting. And this is really available to any OSU researcher who wants to answer or tackle a pragmatic research question. So who are the partners in the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network? So we have general internal medicine. So I am an internal medicine and pediatrics primary care provider, and I'm housed in the Division of General Internal Medicine. So we have our division partnering with the Clinical Trials Management Office and the CCTS to provide not only stakeholder expertise, regulatory oversight, and organizational research support, but we're also there to give you access to the pragmatic clinical environment. And so oftentimes I'll meet with investigators and they'll sit down with me and say, well, I do research in cardiovascular disease, and it might be somebody from the public health background. So we'll start talking about those research questions, what they are, and we can help tailor a project that asks similar questions, but we'll say, well, this is our particular population, and this is what our clinicians would be willing to do, and here's what we can test and design, so that the investigator doesn't spend all this time developing a project that just cannot be done in a clinical setting. So we really want our investigators to succeed, and we like to partner with people, just like from a biostats standpoint, we want to partner with people very early in their study so that they can succeed. So, there are these pieces, but you as an investigator, if you want to do pragmatic studies, are a very key piece in this network in order to make pragmatic clinical studies happen. So just wanted to talk to you a little bit about our Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network and what you get when you come and talk to me. So we have over 50,000 patients within our network. We have 7 clinical practice sites that are spread geographically over Greater Columbus. So we have some urban practices, suburban practices, and then we also have some practices that are set in socioeconomic socioeconomically challenged areas as well. We have a very diverse patient population. We have geriatricians in our network, general internists, pediatricians, and by the nature of primary care, we have patients with multiple chronic conditions. So we can not only pick out patients for you who maybe have a single chronic disease diagnosis, but if you want to study a particular question or project in a multi-morbid population, we have many patients who have numerous chronic diseases, and you can really look at the interplay of how your research question plays out in patients with very complex disease. We have a large population of patients with disability, and then because we take care of pediatric patients who grow up into adulthood, we also have a panel of patients with rare diseases. We have 50 plus clinician stakeholders, a large, wonderful team of nurses and clinical staff who not only support our clinicians, but who are used to doing research in the clinical setting. And we really have equipped our clinical settings to be familiar and adept at research. So our clinical sites all have city-trained nurses and staff so that they can come alongside the clinician stakeholders as well as the investigators in doing a study. So I also want to talk briefly about some examples of what the Pragmatic Clinical Trials has done with investigators, because otherwise I'm afraid it will be just very amorphous. So I just wanted to give you some specifics just as you're thinking through, is this an environment that could help me with my research? So we work with investigators across the university. We've worked with investigators from 6 different colleges, but we primarily work with investigators from the health sciences division. So we work very closely with the College of Medicine, the College of Public Health, the College of Pharmacy, the College of Veterinary Medicine, and we've done studies for all of them. So one example of a study we have ongoing is looking at pharmacogenomic testing, so a type of test where patients get a buccal swab looking at how they process and metabolize psychotropic medications, and looking at the effect of that testing in a pharmacy-based clinical pharmacist-based workflow to standard care, and looking at rates of how medications are titrated, and then also the severity of major depressive disorder. And this is something that really has integrated our staff, so we had to train our staff in how to do pharmacogenomic testing. It involved EHR. It involved making sure that we put the screening tests of severity of depressive symptoms in a place that can be mined from a data perspective, and then also making sure that we develop clinical workflows to allow our pharmacy investigators to actually implement this workflow where medications can be titrated for patients who have had the buccal swab. And those are things that, as an investigator, there are processes that the researchers had come up with, but we were really able to say, this is what matters to the clinicians and to the patients. So if we're going to do this, we really want to make sure that it's helping control symptoms, and that is an important outcome to look at. So how can we do that? How can we make sure we're giving screening tests to these patients in a regular way when you're recruiting somebody to your study? And we were able to not only help with the study design, but also the specific workflow pieces to allow the study to come to fruition. And we started this project about 5 months ago, and have recruited about 45 patients, and the target sample size was 50, and I think we've been able to be successful because of this partnership. Another example is of an ongoing study is a project that I have ongoing with a researcher in the College of Public Health, looking at postpartum care for women with gestational diabetes. diabetes. And this investigator wanted me to help structure a study and implement a study where we are testing a new model of care for postpartum mothers. And so she wanted to look at postpartum follow-up as well as postpartum screening for women with gestational diabetes. So we were able, through the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network, not only to help her with study design and study development, but then we were able to meet with the primary care network at OSU, develop a IHIS referral that would allow us to get these dyads of patients and recruit them. And we were able to train our schedulers on how do you actually schedule patients in this model of care, and then get our clinicians on board. So I was able to talk to a group of 10 clinicians who are going to be taking these dyads of moms and babies and taking care of them, so that there is actually an experimental arm for this study. And it is really hard as an investigator to know even all of those pieces that need to be put in place without somebody who is advocating for you within the network. And then I also have a lot of people coming to me prior to grant submissions who say, I'm not a clinician, or I need a primary care population. I'd really like to apply for this RFA. Here's kind of what I was thinking, but I don't really have the details to put down in a PCORI application as far as my stakeholders and what the specific workflow is going to be, and what do you think about that. So we are able to really design a study that can be done in a clinical setting, so that post-award the investigator isn't scrambling and trying to readjust their protocol to fit and to actually recruit participants. So what can the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network do for you? So basically, we would like to collaborate with you to develop pragmatic studies. We want these studies to be smart because they have to work for the patients who are participating, as well as the providers who are going to be partners with you in helping their patients not only be identified but also buy into the studies. We want to answer timely and relevant research questions. So I think that when you're thinking about whether to use the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network, it really needs to be a question that is going to be interesting to the clinician and to the patient, because otherwise it's going to be hard to get that buy-in and get providers to come alongside as stakeholders. We really try to structure our study so that you can get data in a less than 6-month period. And then we also help conduct preliminary and feasibility studies for external funding. So just to really help investigators get going in the early phases of research so that you can succeed as you grow as a researcher. So this is our workflow. So a lot of times what has happened to us historically is that we have had investigators come to us right there at the implementation recruitment stage. And they'll say, oh, I'm post-award and I put in that we're going to recruit patients from your division. Somebody mentioned that it would be okay. Here's what we would like to do. And it is a very large sample size. It's not necessarily driven towards, an easy recruitment strategy, and then they may also have a very narrow window of opportunity in which patients can be recruited, and that is just like including your biostatistician at the very end is a prescription for failure. Including your clinical team right at the very end is also another prescription for failure, because in those situations, I've usually seen that we have not been able to, even when we try as hard as we can, recruit the patients in the numbers that are needed for the study. But what we would like to do is to start right at the beginning. So if you are planning a project, to consult, really help identify your stakeholders. So we have, clinicians who are very passionate, for example, about opiate use in our patient population. How do we make it safer, and what are things that we can test and interventions that we can implement that will make overdoses less likely and it more safe for us to prescribe opiates. So we can identify those stakeholders who have a passion that aligns with your research passion clinically. And then we would like to collaboratively develop your study. There are so many resources for regulatory support within the CCTS and the university. We like to have a role in at least checking your regulatory documents because we really take the protection of our patients and our network very seriously. And then once we've gone through those stages, we absolutely help you with implementation of the study and recruitment. And then we can also come alongside you and the biostatistician team to help with analysis because we have a lot of information about how data was collected, what some barriers were, what some pitfalls were, and then can maybe help answer some of the hidden questions that come up in the data analysis phase. And so, people have asked, what do your services cost? How do we come to you? So right now, I will say that we are very cost conscious in supporting our investigators because we really want to be agile and help you do your research in an economically challenged environment. But many of our studies are supported by pilot grants. We have had people come to us post-award and say, I have this grant to recruit patients for this particular intervention. It's not going well. Can we expand to include your network? And then we'll have conversations about how to make that happen. There are select studies that would be great fits for the CCTS core, and I think that if you're trying to figure out should I apply for a voucher to access Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network services, I think the major question to ask is this a study that helps translate to practice or translate to a population? So we really think that the T3, T4 types of studies are great for the voucher, and then there are some investigators that also use startup funds. But we do try to do streamlined studies that aren't too expensive. And you can contact us through the core. So you've seen this in multiple slides. So this is a common theme as to how to access research services. If you select the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Network, the consultation request will come to us. If you have any questions about, is my study a good Pragmatic Clinical Trials fit, you can feel free to email me and contact me directly before you put in the core. But that's about all I have, but I am happy to take any questions if you have them. Okay. Great, thank you very much.